head of the Northwest Leadership Academy, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome everybody here this morning for today's masterclass. As you all know, we're talking about leading across generations in the workplace. And this is brought to you by the Northwest Collaborative. It's really great to see everyone doing their introduction. So please, can I just encourage everybody just to say who you are? You know, I'm sure there's people there you haven't seen for a bit, and to just have that chance to introduce yourself and see who else is in the room, in the virtual room. So a few just little things. You'll have seen the housekeeping rules popping up. If we can just do a bit of a reminder, if you can keep your microphones off, I think we're all very aware of all that. Keep microphones off during presentations. We really want this to be interactive, and you'll see that as we go through. So please use the chat box as said. Also share some comments, share your thoughts, and any questions during the morning. It's really important that we'll get that. And I haven't had an introduction to what we're talking about. I'm sure there will be lots and lots of questions and interactive conversations. Also, just a reminder, we are actually recording the session, and that will be sent out afterwards with a link and the slides, so they'll be available after the event. Just a little bit about our collaborative. We're very proud to be part of the collaborative. It's made up of 6 partners, and that's across the NHS, social care, and also local government. And we're able to combine our unique specialisms, and so therefore we can bring some real innovative, thought-provoking speakers to really look and grow and develop our leadership knowledge across the Northwest. The 6 partners are on the screen. So we've got Aqua, MIAA, us, the Northwest Leadership Academy, Northwest ADAS, Northwest Employers, and new to the collaborative, and I know we mentioned this last time, is the Health Innovation Northwest Coast. So really great that we all work together in producing these fantastic masterclasses. So what I'd like to do is just give a brief introduction to today and then just talk through the session. We're going to start in a few minutes. Caris, I'll be introducing Caris. And then, as you'll see, she's going to talk us through about leading across generations in the workplace. I'll give you a brief introduction in a minute. We'll have a little bit of time for questions, and then we'll be finishing promptly at 11 o'clock. Really looking forward to today's session. So just a little bit about it. Generational leadership is about leading in a way that recognises values and brings together the different perspectives and expectations of multiple age groups within the workforce. Something I found particularly interesting, for the first time in history, we've got up to 6 different generations who are working side by side. So today we're going to talk about how effective leaders understand those different generational experiences, how they're shaping motivation, communication, well-being, and the different ways they work, but also how we can all adapt our leadership styles accordingly. So today I've got an absolute pleasure, and I met Caris on Monday, and she gave me a brief overview of what's the session. So I'm generally as excited as you all as well to talk through this. So Caris Ward is a workplace and coaching psychologist. She's a workplace psychologist and also specialises in leadership coaching. And what she looks at is really what's going on beneath our behaviour and understanding how this actually then changes how we lead and we connect and we communicate. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Caris, and I'm sure she may give you a little brief introduction as well. So thank you so much, and I'll hand over now.
Thank you so much. So it's absolutely wonderful to meet you all here. I can see already there's a lot of introductions in the chat, so please feel free to keep going with introductions, as it's great for you to obviously also know who is in the room, as well as myself too. So I'm going to share my screen, so hopefully all being well, that should now show. So in terms of myself, as Frances mentioned, so I'm a workplace specialist and coaching psychologist, and my almost stance is that every behaviour makes sense when you see what's underneath. So my purpose is to help others who ultimately help other people. So whether your role is in palliative care, helping people live their best quality of life right up to the end, whether you work in housing, helping everyone get shelter from the storm, or whether you work in OD, supporting teams to thrive, my aim is to help you to do what you do best. And one of my absolute sweet spots is generational differences at work, because it matters. It's causing a lot of confusion and frustration for leaders and organisations alike. And it's challenging to get right, especially when we're not necessarily aware of what's going on under that behavioural waterline. So whether it's running talks like this, running trainer sessions, or working one-on-one with individuals, my vision is to help people to live a life well led, but organisations to support their people to truly set them up for success. So in terms of today's session, what to expect, what we're going to cover, there's three key things really that we're going to be touching on right throughout the session. So firstly, we're going to unpick some of the myths and stereotypes about generations. There's a lot of information out there, some good, some more on the myth side. So we'll start to unpick what that actually looks like in reality. We're also going to be exploring some of the generational picture actually informed by the evidence base. What does peer-reviewed research actually show, and how we can ultimately take this into step 3, which is what it means for you, for your leadership, for your team, and for your organisation as well. So with that being said, I know there's a lot of introductions already in the chat, but it'd be wonderful to know, if you haven't already introduced yourself, please feel free to. But if you have, it'd be wonderful to know what you hope to gain from today's session. If it goes well and you think, what a brilliant session, as you hit that big red button at the end, what are you leaving with? So I can see in the chat already quite a few people have done introductions. So we've got Stephanie Thomas from Clatterbridge Cancer Centre. Welcome, Stephanie. We've got Rachel Warden, team leader in medical records and scanning department from Chorley Hospital. Alice, welcome Alice. Andrew, Vicky Edwards, Jess Devine, Marasha. We've got Joe. So what is it that you hope to gain if we get today right? So I can see by Bethany's, the topic has been coming up a lot in my development sessions and coaching really recently. So this is very, very timely. And we are seeing it come more front and centre generally in widespread life. It's quite interesting when we think about generations, because where there are people, there are generations. So even inside of work, we're seeing it come more to the forefront, but outside as well. And I love it, Tim. Gen X, absolutely love it. What are the myths and what is the actual evidence? Yeah, there is. It's a lot to wade through. So we'll be running through some absolute key hitters today. Charlie, how to work better with colleagues that aren't in my generation. Again, it can be challenging, and we'll touch on some of the challenges as well as we go through. Knowledge that can be shared on the best ways to manage and lead multi-generational teams. And it's really interesting when we think about multi-generational teams, they often perform better and more innovative, more creative, more overall in terms of higher performing. But there are certain criteria that will either set a multi-generational team up for success or hold a multi-generational team back. So absolutely we'll be covering that. So keep popping in what you hope to gain from today's session. We're going to start to move through. A couple of things I did want to mention. So as Francis discussed, pop all questions that you have in the chat. There is no question too small, too silly, or conversely too big. What I've agreed is that we're going to kind of compile all the questions that are raised in the chat today that we can't necessarily reach by the end of the session. I'm going to go away and be able to come back to you with some answers. So if you think of a question, actually we'll be able to share the answer with everyone. So definitely implore you to light up the chat with all your questions as we go. The other side to this is that, as I mentioned, where there are people, there are generations. And if we look at how many people we have in the room, looking at about 106 people, we all have a vast amount of experience and expertise in the context of generations, because where there are people, there are generations. So you might reflect on your own experience from a work point of view. You might also think about, your local football club that you go to, or local sewing club, whatever it might be. Even people down the local pub, where there are people, there are generations. So feel free as well to share your expertise, because if we were to add up all the years that we have here in terms of experience, it is actually quite a lot. So with that being said, one of the things that I did want to start out with is, as Francis mentioned, we are at a point where generations is becoming a topic that is talked about more and more and more, and as was alluded to in the chat as well. It's a topic that's more front and centre. We're seeing this in the workplace, but we're also seeing this even outside of the workplace in the context of media. So I did a little bit of a skim of some of the popular media titles or newspaper headlines in relation to generations, because it starts to build up a little bit of a picture. So here we can see some not so favourable. So the table manners are under threat from Gen Z and why we shouldn't give them up. Of course, Gen Z hate baby boomers. They're stealing all the space. Don't blame the boomers. It was Gen X that sat by and let the world crumble. And it goes on. It's quite polarizing. And I particularly enjoy this last one. A generation with a huge sense of entitlement. Bosses complain that millennials are spoilt, full of themselves, averse to hard work, and expect success on a plate. So what does that mean for society? It's very dramatic. But the reality is we are starting to see this polarized approach when it comes to generations absolutely flood the media. One particular title that stood out to me is this one, sort of the big question that we're all faced with, which is why the generation wars feel worse than ever. And we're going to start to delve into why this might be the case as we go through today's session, because we're seeing it on a kind of societal level. We're seeing it also in the context of intergenerational teams. We're really seeing and feeling that friction, and even at an organizational level as well. So in terms of where we're at the very start of this session, what I would love for you to do is to pop into the chat on a scale of 1 to 10, where would you rate your current knowledge of generational differences? If you're kind of at the, I kind of have heard the topic, not necessarily what the generations are, but I know it's something that's more front and center. So you might put yourself towards the lower end of that scale, kind of 1 or a 2. Versus 10, I am kind of researching it day in, day out. I talk about it every day, all day long. You might put yourself at a 10. So in terms of where you feel that you're at, in terms of that scale 1 to 10, where would you place yourself? So pop in the chat where you feel, and we'll get a bit of a sense of where you feel that you're at and where we are as a collective room of about 100 people. So we've got a few at 5, at 4 and 5, a 6, a 5, a 7, 5, 3, 5. So you can see a few 3s as well, 4s. Andrew, solid 10, absolutely love that. 2, a 3, a 4. So we're seeing quite a spread, but it's sort of definitely centering around that kind of 4 and 5 on the whole. So that my hope is that wherever your kind of position is on that scale of 1 to 10 as we start out on this generational journey throughout today's session, by the end of the session, when again you hit that big red button, that you leave 1, 2, 3, 4 or even 5 points up that scale with a really solid understanding of what generational differences are, but also what it means for you, your leadership and your organizations too. So with that being said, we know there's a big spread of some people who know a lot about generational differences, some people who are really here to kind of learn from the outset. I wanted to give you the opportunity to find out which generation you are in. So on this next screen, we've got all 6 generations that we are currently seeing in the workplace. So right from the silent generation, born 1928 to 1945, all the way to Gen Alpha, born 2011 to 2024. What's really interesting when it comes to the generations is that there's a little bit of debate as to what the actual year ranges are, which we'll come on to in a sec, but broadly speaking, this represents the majority of generations at the moment. So we've got silent generation, baby boomers, born 1946 to 64, Gen X, 65 to 1980, millennials, 81 to 95, Gen Z, 96 to 2010, Gen Alpha, 2011 to 2024. And what is also Gen Beta, because we're going alpha, beta, and so on and so forth in terms of the Greek alphabet. They were born January 2025 and onwards. One of the really kind of key questions I get is, what happened before the silent generation? And there were generations that also preceded the silent generation. So there were 2 generations that we kind of titled as generations. There was the greatest generation, which was 1901 to 1927, and the lost generation, which was about 1882 to 1900. We did have generations before that, we just didn't necessarily have distinct names or categories. So now you know what generation you are. One of the important things to note is if you're kind of at the end of one generation and almost at the start of the next, as I said, because the dates kind of flex depending on what variety of things, but there's no real kind of clear consensus. You are actually known as a cusper. So if you kind of bridge one or the other, so you might decide which kind of camp you fall in generationally. So my next question for you, which I'd love to put your guesses again in the chat, is what marks the end of one generation and the start of the next? So what is it that kicks off one generation versus into the next? I can see one question in the chat from Marlena. So when we talk about generations, do we take country of origin into account? So this is a really interesting question because globally we do not have one unified sense of what generations are. This is very much a Western version. However, what we do know is that there are still generations in other areas of the world. What they are typically known for in terms of stereotypes map pretty consistently. There are some nuances, but overall the kind of general traits are typically the same, but obviously the names also differ. So it's not an exact match as well. In terms of some of the guesses, we've got wealth, technology, school year, societal change, technological environment, government change, lots of lifestyle, society norms, events, technology, and so keep going with the guesses. I can see a couple of people have got it bang on. So we've got again, technological shift definitely feeds into it. Definitely fits into it. What's really interesting is, Emma, I love that you've raised years and time because this is one of the biggest misconceptions that we have when it comes to generational differences, that it's a fixed kind of year and it just replicates in a really structured format. What we know is the years aren't exactly the same length. So, for example, the silent generation is about 17-year gap. We then have baby boomers, which is about an 18-year gap. And then it goes down to 15, 14, 14, 13. And we are seeing these years collapse and go smaller and smaller and smaller. And if you ask some like specialists, particularly in this area, we're anticipating that the number of generations is in the workplace is essentially set to increase because, and a couple of people have tapped onto it, the thing that defines the end of one and the start of the next is big world events. So it feeds in from technology, it feeds into a lot of the economic environment as well. And an example of this is the baby boomers. So if you think about baby boomers, they went into their pivotal kind of really formative years, and between Gen X was around the 80s recession. So a massive impact. Equally, one of the things that's marked as how do you tell a millennial from a Gen Z? Well, a millennial will be able to tell you where they were when they heard about the World Trade Center event in America, whereas a Gen Z won't. And Gen Beta, which again, we're not obviously in the workplace quite yet because they're only about 1.5, but we're anticipating their generation to be the first generation that will have had AI right from the outset. And it's really interesting because we're hearing about world events far more rapidly than we ever have done before, thanks to technology. And so we are potentially more influenced. And this is where we're starting to see this gap go now more narrow and narrow and narrow. And so really generational differences isn't particularly a topic that is set to go anywhere. And in fact, we've got 6 at the moment, which is a challenge. So how do we manage when we even have sort of 7, 8, 9, 10 or even more? In some cases of speculation, they're anticipating that generations might be as close as only 5 years apart, which is staggering, especially when we think about what does that mean for the world of work. So one of the things when it comes to the myths is around the stereotypes. And some of the stereotypes we might hear that might be propagated from some of those media headlines that we heard, but also the things that we might be almost feeling like we see in society. So what I want to do is play a little game with you if you're willing to play. So this game is higher or lower generational addition. Now we are going broadly off kind of the stereotypes here. I'm going to show a statement at the top of the screen. I'm then going to show you one generation, and when I show the second, I'll ask, is it higher or lower in relation to that statement at the top? We'll take the first one really slowly so you can get a feel for it, but I'd love for you to pop in the chat what you think the correct answer is. Do you think it's higher or do you think it's lower? So like I said, we'll take the first one really slowly, but there are 6 in total, so keep a mark of how many you score because we'll check in how many you scored at the end. So, thinking about preferring formal communication, our baseline generation is our silent generation. And so the question is, do Gen Z or Gen Z have a higher or lower preference for formal communication than the silent generation? What do you think? Higher or lower? So I can see the answers coming in thick and fast in the chat. Pretty unanimous, I think, at this point. I'll give you a couple more seconds to pop in your answer if you are currently typing in the chat. It is unanimously lower. And this is what we know. We know that our silent generation are typically the ones that have a greater preference for formal communication. So if we think about what formal communication typically means, it might mean more formal in terms of letter versus emails rather than the instant message, the chat functions that Gen Z are reported to obviously prefer. But equally, even in terms of style, if we think about what formal communication style looks like, it'd be dear and then a name and then either yours sincerely, kind regards, whatever it might be, just even in terms of that style of communication as well. So if you got that one right and you said lower, give yourself a point. So on to our second one. We've got desire for more purpose in work. These do get a little harder as we go, I have to say. So our baseline is baby boomer. So the question is, do millennials have a higher or lower desire for more purpose in work? And I love that, Tim, in the chat. My 24-year-old colleague recently asked me what postage stamp was for. Fantastic. So we can see the answers coming in thick and fast. There's a bit more sort of split on this. A few people saying higher, a few people saying lower. Like I said, this one does start to get a little harder as we go. So hopefully you've got your answer. Keep popping in the chat. So the reveal. So the answer to this is higher. Millennials are stereotypically noted for having a greater desire for more purpose in work, often reported if we look at kind of not peer-reviewed research, but kind of general white papers, typically might use it as a form to assess what organization they're going to apply for. You know, is that organization one that aligns with my purpose? Do they have a really strong purpose? What's corporate social responsibility like, for example? So again, if you got that one right, give yourself another mark. On to our third one. So desire for frequent feedback. Our baseline for this one is Gen X. So the question is, do millennials have a higher or lower desire for frequent feedback at work? So again, I can see this one's another split one. We've got some people saying higher, some people saying lower. So I can see, I think on the whole, we've got maybe a split, maybe towards higher a little bit, but it is still split across the board. Katie saying lower, Jenny saying higher. So I'll give you another couple of seconds for this one. Okay, so hopefully you've got your answer. The correct answer is higher. So millennials are reported to have a greater desire for frequent feedback at work. The kind of underpinning assumption being that millennials will assume they're doing wrong until they're told they're doing right, versus Gen X will assume they're doing right until they're told otherwise. On to question number 4. So values autonomy. So thinking about autonomy as that ability to have a say over kind of what I do. On the left, we've got Gen X. So the question for this one is, do Gen Alpha, are we anticipating, because at their kind of oldest age, they're 16, they're doing work experience and kind of entering that workforce, are we expecting a higher or lower value for autonomy than Gen X? So I think this one might be our biggest split so far. Looks about 50-50. Higher versus lower. Kirsty saying higher, Karen saying higher, Emma saying lower. So I think this might be the closest split yet. And it's a tough one. Like I said, they do get harder as we go. So feel free if you're still typing, keep popping in the chat. But the answer for this one at the moment, what we're speculating is that Gen X will have a higher value for autonomy, particularly when we think about what's happened in the course of Gen Alpha's how they've grown up in terms of like both technology, but also navigating COVID. Really, the anticipation is they're going to have a higher desire for more kind of support and supporting that readiness for work over Gen X. Like I said, this is all based on stereotype. A lot of it's speculation as well. So it's quite interesting when we sort of dig into it. In terms of our next one, we have a preference for team collaboration. So on the left-hand side, we have Gen X. On the right-hand side, we have millennial. So the question is, do millennials have a higher or lower preference for team collaboration than Gen X? So again, a little bit of a split, but it definitely seems to be swaying one way. I'll give you a couple more minutes for this one. And again, it is a tough one. In terms of the reveal, what we have, millennials typically are known for having a higher preference for team collaboration if we look at kind of from a stereotype point of view. When I ran this session with senior leaders, there was a Gen X in the room who said, hang on a minute. No, no, no. I like team collaboration if that team involves me, myself, and I. So take from that what you will. But we are swiftly on to our next one, which is a desire for flexible working. So our baseline is baby boomers. So the question is, do Gen Z or Gen Z have a higher or lower preference for flexible working? I think this one might be driving the quickest response in the chat. Definitely. So we've had somebody saying equal, which is interesting. We've got some saying lower, but quite a few saying higher. Kay saying higher, Claire saying higher, Shanti saying lower. Marasha saying higher. So final couple of seconds for this one. So in terms of the desire for flexible working, stereotypically, Gen Z are reported to have a higher desire for flexible working. But actually, the equal answer was quite interesting because if we look at what's happening across the board, the different kind of areas of life course, actually, we know that, for example, baby boomers might be entering into grandparenthood where there's an increased desire for flexible working as well. And when we think about flexible working, it also links to, for example, hybrid, to using technology, etc. So it's quite interesting when we actually dig into what rests underneath in relation to the kind of stereotype that we know is out there, and it's very prolific in terms of the media too. So thinking about how well you know your generational stereotypes, I'd love for you to pop in the chat how many you scored out of 6. So feel free to pop into the chat how many you scored. We've got a couple of 5s, a 6, 4, a couple of 4s as well. Which is great. 6, 6. We've got Alexandra at 4, Catherine at 5, Alison 4, Sati 4. Laura at 4 as well, Donald at 5. So really, we've got pretty good sense of our generational stereotypes. But as I said, we're talking about some of the myths, some of the stereotypes that we have. And actually, we know that there's quite a lot that's talked about generally in the media, and we talk about it kind of loosely within society. But actually, there's a real opportunity to explore what are the challenges that we're actually seeing in real life, in real time, both in relation to work, thinking about your teams, your organizations, your peers, your colleagues, but also thinking outside of work as well. So with that in mind, we're going to pop you into a breakout to start to delve into some of the challenges that you're experiencing in relation to generational differences. What are your biggest generational challenges that you're seeing and witnessing, facing? So we're going to pop you into a breakout for about sort of 10 minutes shortly. And this is really interesting. One of the examples we've already had in the chat from Tim was around a colleague asking, what is a stamp for? Equally, I remember hearing a story of a previous director of mine who had, again, Gen Z, come into the office, point to the corner, to a machine in the corner and pointed and said, "What's that?" And it was a fax machine. A lot of the younger generations, Gen Z onward, will have no idea what a fax machine is. And equally, if we're to ask them, what is the button, what's the logo that you click when you hit save? I'd love to know if anyone can say what is that logo when you hit save on a document. It's a floppy disk.
Floppy disk.
Absolutely. It's a floppy disk. But a lot of people, if we talk about kind of the kind of younger end of millennials, Gen Z onwards, won't have a clue. We'll never held a floppy disk in their hand. So it's really interesting when we start to think about even some of the language that we use and the references that we talk about. So I believe Christina's going to pop you into a breakout now. So we're going to have about 10 minutes. I'm going to pull you back. I'm going to ask you to share your kind of key themes you came up with again back in the chat. If you are in a position where you're in an office and you're not necessarily able to talk, when you're in your breakout rooms, you can use the chat function in there as well. But feel free as well to come back off. To come off of mute and have a conversation with others in the breakout room. But don't worry if you need to use the chat to be able to engage as well, or if you're in a space where you can do neither. For example, you're dialing in on a mobile phone, or the chat function just isn't working, then make a note on whatever you've got next to you, a post-it note or a pad, whatever that might be. So Christina, I'm going to ask if you're happy to pop people into breakout rooms. I have just about everybody back. So it would be wonderful if you're able to pop what were the key challenges that came up for you in your discussions into the chat. What were the key challenges that you're seeing? So Karen's got managing expectations, definitely. Different expectations depending on which generation you sit in, definitely factors into it for sure. It's a challenge that comes up quite often, especially when we might have our own expectations from our perspective, but perhaps somebody who is a Gen Z might have a different perspective as well. We've got attitudes to flexible working and working from home, definitely that kind of working practices. Support requirements, understanding, resilience and the handling of stress, individual needs, when we're open with needs, which is very interesting. Definitely something that we're seeing. Resilience coming up a few times, keeping up with technology. I mean, it's changing at the absolute speed of light, it feels like, at this point. Over-reliance on technology, AI, really specific AI application forms. Yeah, particularly when we think about jobs as well, it's really factoring in terms of recruitment. We've got communication styles, leadership challenges for mixed generational teams. Again, keeping up with the pace of technology changes. Communication, so some staff members do not like making or taking calls. Definitely that features quite a lot when we talk about some of the challenges that we face, our natural kind of preferences, but also on the flip side, some of the challenges that we might experience if it's not a natural preference, if we're not used to making phone calls, actually it can be quite almost anxiety inducing for many. Resilience of younger generations, again, that perception that's not as much resilience as older generations. Wellbeing discussions being more front and center. Fear of failure, how this looks to others as well would differ. hybrid working. I mean, there's so much, isn't there, when we think about the challenges that we're seeing, and it's right across the board. One of the interesting ones that I've found comes up quite a bit is even to the point of language. The language that we use can differ so dramatically. One of the terms that's been floating around in the younger generations is a term called Riz. So Riz means charisma, which is something that I learned. So in case anybody else is also scratching their heads, then now you know. But equally, I can reflect on when I was the age of the kind of younger end of Gen Z, way back when, and I was working in an office with individuals. There was quite a big age gap between me and the rest of the team, and they were talking about Bay City rollers. And I turned around and went, "Oh, what's that?" So quite intrigued. And the response I got was, "What? What? It's who?" And then I proceeded to get an education. And of course, I knew the music, but I hadn't grown up at that kind of particular pivotal time where they were prevalent in the 70s, where I would have known exactly who they were. I know, Karen, they're absolutely fantastic. I mean, you're talking about Bye Bye Baby, Saturday Night, absolute classics. So it's really interesting when we even focus on some of the language that we use in workplaces that might also depend on when we've grown up, when we've had those pivotal moments in life, particularly formative years, thinking about early adulthood as well. It all starts to change. So it's really interesting. We start to see where some of those generational tensions might actually come into play. So, as we've mentioned, there's lots of challenges, and they broadly fit into kind of three categories, especially when we reflect on what the challenges are that come out from a research point of view. Ooh. So we have three most common challenges: communication barriers, like we've mentioned, kind of in language, conflicting work habits. So again, it links to expectations. It links even to broader things from a resilience point of view, feeds into it as well. But also a fundamental lack of understanding between generations, which makes it quite challenging. And especially when we think about leading multi-generational teams, it can leave us often kind of scratching our heads as to what we do to really get the best out of our team, where we are seeing those benefits of it being innovative, better, like creativity within a team. But we are battling against some of the not so positive stereotypes. Now, on this next page, I'm about to show you the not so positive stereotypes of each generation. But what that means is I'm also going to show you your generation's not so positive stereotypes. So take this with a pinch of salt as we move on. So as you can see, we've got generations across the top. Now, typically when we start to look at challenges and we ask different generations kind of where their challenges are, we tend to see the silent generation as change resistors, overly traditional values, really struggle with technology. Baby boomers, rigid in work culture, don't understand the younger generations. Gen X being overly independent, disengaged and cynical. Millennials, entitled, lazy, with a lack of loyalty, often found job hopping. Gen Z with short attention spans, interpersonal skills that are lacking, and we're anticipating Gen Alpha, digital over-reliant and lacking real-world solutions. But one thing that's quite interesting is we often don't necessarily see the negative stereotype in ourselves, but we see the negative stereotype of other generations and vice versa. There's a real issue with this, especially when we look at this from a category perspective, because there's no factory that pumps out boomers. There's no factory that pumps out Gen Z. And so actually, when we delve into what we're actually looking at, it's where it starts to get quite interesting, and we really get under the hood of what generational differences actually are. So I'm going to show you a quote on the screen, and my question to you, what I'd love for you to pop in the chat, is when do you think this quote was reportedly from? Slight caveat, it's not an exact quote, but I'd love you to guess when it was from. Bonus points if you want to have a guess at who said it. So I'll read the quote out to you now. So I see no hope for the future of our people if they are dependent on the frivolous youth of today, for certainly all youth are reckless beyond words. When I was young, we were taught to be discreet and respectful of elders, but the present youth are exceedingly disrespectful and impatient. So my question to you is, if you were to hazard a guess, when do you think this quote was reportedly from? And a Brucey bonus if you want to have a guess at who said it. We've got some guesses coming through. So we've got, if I scroll to the top of the guesses, so 1500s, 1960s, 1800s, 1835, 1940s, 1930s, kind of like the 60s, couple of guesses at 60s. Jim's guessing 1800. We've got again 2025, 1960s, 1945, 2026 this year. Lavinia, I love that guess. Joanna, the 50s. So we're kind of guessing sort of, there's a couple of guesses as to 1500s. It might be a Charles Dickens quote from 1890 we've got. It could be any time, and you are absolutely right, Emma. This quote could have been said yesterday, like we've had a guess of 2026. It could have been said many, many years ago. Somebody mentioned Socrates, and it is absolutely true. We could say that this quote is from any time because it really does apply. Now, this quote was reportedly from Hesiod, a poet from 700 BCE. So you're talking about 2,400 years ago in ancient Greece. In his works, in his piece of work, Working Days. Now, this is not an exact quote. As we know through time, things kind of get butchered and almost bolted on. So what was actually kind of said in Works and Days is not this exact piece, but the sentiment is true. And we know that a lot of that sentiment was held right across the board. But we can take this even one step further than ancient Greece, because we do have exact translations of tablets from 4,000 years ago. So if you think ancient Greece was 2,400-ish years ago, we are talking even further in the past. So Oxford University has transcriptions online that you can go and Google, and they took some of the tablets from Mesopotamia. So it's modern day Iraq, but it was 4,000 years ago. And it's a supervisor to a scribe. Now, a scribe was quite high profile sort of role at the time, it's quite prestigious. And so the quote goes like this. So this is the translation. Like you, I was once a youth and had a mentor. The teacher assigned a task to me. It was like man's work. Like a springing reed, I leapt up and put myself to work. I did not depart from my teacher's instructions, and I did not start doing things on my own initiative. My mentor was delighted with my work on the assignment. He rejoiced that I was humble before him, and he spoke in my favour. There, I have recited to you what my teacher revealed, and you will not neglect it. You should pay attention. Taking to heart will be of your benefit. To which the scribe responds, I shall give you a response to what you have just recited like a magic spell and a rebuttal to your charming ditty delivered in a bellow. Do not make me out to be an ignoramus. I will answer you once and for all. You opened my eyes like a puppy's and you made me into a human being. But why do you go on outlining the rules for me as if I was a shirker? Anyone hearing your words would feel insulted. Now, if we turn this into modern day language, in a nutshell, we have the supervisor saying, back in my day, I followed the rules, I didn't question authority, and you should do the same. And the scribe saying, thanks for the lecture, but get off my back and stop talking to me like I'm a slacker. We can start to see that the themes of a lot of what we talk about today were being spoken about and written about 4,000 years ago. But it's not just the younger generation where this kind of sentiment was held, because we know we have other quotes such as this one. So men of age object too much, consult too long, adventure too little, repent too soon, and seldom drive business home. And this was by Francis Bacon in his 17th century essays of youth and age, essentially calling the older generations change resistors, which again, if you think back to the stereotypes, is pretty much marries up with what we know as our stereotypes today. But the middle generations don't get off lightly either. Plato was reported to have said that the younger generations have passion and no wisdom, the older generations have wisdom and no passion, and the middle generations have neither. So take from that what you will. It's quite savage in many ways. But actually, when we translate this back, when we now look at what we're seeing, when we look at the generations, we can start to see that we are not seeing personality types. We're not seeing distinct categories. What we're actually seeing is age plus environment. Now, the age is important because, like we've seen, a lot of the themes were talked about 4,000 years ago, even earlier than that. But they weren't necessarily talking about AI, social media, the COVID pandemic. So we know that environment has a massive influence. And this is where the research gets really interesting, particularly when we know that a lot of the research shows that actually the generational differences that we think we can't really replicate, we can't really see, because what we're trying to do is to take kind of continuous data, which is age, and we're trying to force it into categorical data, which is really challenging when we start to then think of the stereotypes that come off it that don't really match up. And it's like, for example, if I were to go into a school, say, and I wanted to investigate height, and I go into kind of a reception class, maybe born in 2018 or 20, a little bit older than that, maybe 2020. And I think, well, they're quite short. And then I look at kind of the year 5 and I go, well, they're taller and they were born in kind of whatever year they were born in. And then I look at the teachers born in 1975. I said, they're really tall. So actually if we take the same fallacy that a lot of the generational research is based on, I'm then saying that people who were born in 2018, 2020 are short, and that is a thing that we can determine from their generation. It's a generational characteristic, and it's not because we know its age because our height grows as we grow. And so often the question I get is, well, what happens when Gen Z get to the age of baby boomers? Gen Z will probably be known as being rigid in work culture, don't understand the younger generations. And we know, like I said, it's not just age, it's age plus environments. There might be some influence, but actually predominantly we can now see that what we're seeing is something quite different to the personality types that are often talked about in the media that put people into categories that do not really quite fit when we look at behaviour. But we can take this a step further. Because when we look at this, we're looking at almost those negative stereotypes, but actually every weakness, if we see these as weaknesses, is a strength in the wrong context. Because as I mentioned before, you're probably looking at your own generation and the negative stereotype and saying, I'm not those things. I think I'm, something in a more positive light. And actually we can turn every single one of these into a strength if we flip it. So if we're to do that, it starts to look like our silent generation are a steady presence during change. Our baby boomers become loyal and deeply experienced. Our Gen X become resilient and self-sufficient. Our millennials drive positive work culture change. Gen Z are quick learners, very socially conscious. And Gen Alpha are anticipating to redefine innovative work. So knowing that actually a lot of the negative stereotypes we can actually quite readily flip, especially when we look through the lens of age plus environment. The question shifts when we think about leadership. So the real leadership challenge is, how do we, at an individual, at team, at an organizational level, how do we leverage these strengths? So first, we have to zoom out a little bit, because we have to explore, what do we all need at work? And there is one of my absolute favourite models when it comes to behaviour, which I've loosely put under the umbrella of golden principles, but I'll walk you through the particular model that I'm referring to, which is known as the self-determination theory. So in 2000, Ryan and Decky published research. They've done a lot of research in this area. I'd highly suggest kind of a bit of a Google. But when they look at internal motivation, specifically looked at it, they found that there's, broadly speaking, 3 core areas that we have to hit regardless. Like if you're a human, these apply. So autonomy, if you remember, it came up earlier, and we know that actually how autonomy, what it means for different generations is different, but every single one of us, whether we are, a toddler just about learning how to walk, versus if we are planning our 80th birthday, we all need autonomy in life, but also in work. So autonomy is the ability, we might not necessarily decide what it is that needs to be done, because that might come from top down, but actually how we do it, how we organise our work is within our gift and within our control. Relatedness, this is about feeling connected to the people to the left, to the right of you, to the broader organisation, feeling like you're a part of something that is bigger than yourself. And competence, the skill and the ability to do what you do and to do it well. It's one of the most robustly tested theories that we have when we think about human behaviour and internal motivation. But it's interesting because we can see this exact model pop up in other areas as well. So one that you might recognise, if you particularly from an NHS perspective, autonomy, belonging and contribution, which came out of a report by Michael West and Koya in 2018. Well worth a read. It's a brilliant read by Michael West and Dame Koya as well. And they talk about autonomy, again, same, belonging, which is basically relatedness. And they talked about competence, but when you actually read what they're talking about contribution. It's not just that I can have that ability to do what I do and do it well, but actually that it has impact, that I can see the impact of the work that I do, that ripple effect. In their context, they were focused on NHS and healthcare. So it's almost that ripple effect. What does it mean for patient care at the end of the day? But even if we take it a step into mainstream media, we can see these principles come out as well. In 2009, Daniel Pink published a book called Drive, and it talks about, again, three things that we need in terms of internal motivation, internal drive, autonomy, purpose, and mastery, all of which marry up very closely to that original self-determination theory, autonomy, relatedness, and competence. The really interesting thing about this is actually when we see this put into practice, if we were to say, again, now knowing what we know, that generations are age plus environment, and we can still use the titles of Gen Z and Boomer, we know that those that are typically in that kind of Gen Z category, what autonomy, relatedness, and competence means to them may very well and is often likely to be different to what it might mean for other generations too. And so we do have some research that points to what those differences might be, which I'll share with you now. So on the left-hand side, we've got stage of life, because really, if we're looking at age and environment and thinking about workplace perspective, stage of life or stage of career really is the thing that we're talking about. So we've got young adults or those that are establishing their career, which typically we see as Gen Z. It's not always. If people do a career shift, they might change where they sit within this as well. We've got the established stage, which predominantly millennials, that kind of mid stage, which is Gen X, and the later stage or latter stage is baby boomers, kind of typically towards that experienced upper end of career. In terms of well-being and the things that tend to be relevant, there are certain things to kind of point out. So, for example, the mid-stage, that Gen X, sandwich stress for many Gen Xers will become a real pivotal factor when we think about well-being. That squeeze between not only parenthood but also caring for older adults. Now, not every Gen X is going to be in that position, but we know if we're talking about numbers and kind of generalizing life stage, that is a factor for many. And equally, when we look at motivators and kind of expectations, that autonomy that's linked to expertise, I've learned a vast amount of knowledge, and now I need the autonomy to be able to put it into practice, to use the knowledge I've gained to add value, which is slightly different than if we say take kind of the establishing part of the career, so young adults in this case, and we look at where the focus around well-being is more of a mental health focus. Now, this is a really interesting one when we start to dig into what we're actually looking at, because we know that Gen Z have higher rates of mental health literacy than other generations when they were the age of Gen Z. Likely because we have access to technology, so we're learning at quite a kind of, we've got access to more information than perhaps we would have done previously. It's becoming more of a front and center topic. But we also know there's a lot of pressure when it comes to mental health, in terms of the fact that if you imagine through the lights of COVID, a lot of that social support has been stripped away. And we know the influence of social media on mental health as well. And so for any of us, regardless of what generation we're in, if we were kind of plucked out and plopped into that generation, actually we'd be feeling and doing much of the same. So it's really interesting because we can start to see where that age plus environment starts to play a factor in terms of mental health focus. But again, motivators and expectations, if we're an earlier part of our career, we're more likely to be focused on chasing things like developmental feedback, because we want to learn. We're in that stage of learning, of developing our knowledge, of growing and establishing ourselves within the career that we have chosen. So again, things like clear progression can be really valuable. And we know that kind of autonomy, the belonging, the contribution, all fit within this. It's just what it looks like for each individual, depending on life stage, will look slightly different. But the other thing is that there's other layers to this, because if we take, for example, the culture within which somebody is born, that will change what autonomy, belonging, contribution looks like. So we can start to see it's not just career stage, it's not just age. Actually, there's more things that factor into it. So it's really interesting, especially when we start to dig into it. One of the really interesting studies that has come out is published hot off the press, 1st of June, I think, this month. It was published from researchers in Greece. and it was done on public health or public sector roles. Now, the challenge in this is that because it was done in Greece, we can't extrapolate it necessarily because culture in Greece is going to be different to culture in the UK. But I did think it came out with something that was very, very interesting because they were looking specifically at the self-determination theory, which we've just covered, and how it maps. And they basically found that it was career stage, really, or life stage that plays the biggest part. At the earlier stage of our career, we're more likely to chase enjoyment, whereas at the upper end, we're more likely to chase challenge. So it's quite interesting we can start to see these differences. Now, we can't say that that's conclusive because it's one study, and we're still at the early stage of really trying to navigate in the research. What are we actually looking at? We're not looking at defined categories. We're actually looking at more of a continuum, and there's a lot of factors that play into it. But that sort of leaves us at a point where, well, what does it mean for you from an individual point of view, supporting individuals in your team and also supporting your team as a whole? Because we know generational friction exists and we know that there are generational differences. It's just how we encapsulate them is slightly different. So focusing on these two sort of key hitters, we've got an individual level. So firstly, what we now know is that rather than asking what generation is somebody in, which we know there isn't a cookie cutter, there's no factory that pumps out boomers, the best question to ask, where is this person in their career and life, and how can I support them to bring their best to work? If we have somebody who is in the boomer generation, who does a complete career transition into another role, their needs in that new career might be very different to somebody who's, again, still a boomer, but has built their career in that sector, in that way. And it starts to shift it into something that looks a little bit more meaningful and starts to represent that actually we're not all the same. And it starts to link it really to compassionate leadership as well. There was some not peer reviewed, but still sort of like research loosely done by Gallup. So they did a survey of, I think it's about 15,000 individuals. And they found that having one meaningful conversation per week with each team member develops high performance relationships more than any other leadership activity. Leadership is a human sport. And this is really interesting when you look at some of the other things that they took out from the survey, this mass survey that they did, because they found that about 16% of people have a meaningful conversation with their manager regularly. Only 16% feeling that they have an extremely meaningful conversation. And actually 10% said yes at being asked how they like to be recognised. So only 10% of people have been asked, how do you like to be recognised? And this is really interesting because often we have that ethos of treat other people how we want to be treated. But that sentiment has long gone. The sentiment now is treat other people how they wish to be treated. And so when we start to fold it back to things like one-to-ones, we can start to see where some of the issues might come into play. Because typically, in terms of how we lead one-to-ones, we might ask, for example, what have you got on? What are the things that are top of your list? What are you stuck with? Kind of what's in the way? And what do you need from me? Not bad questions, but if we think about what makes a meaningful question, actually it sort of leaves a lot to be desired. And so what the questions can ultimately turn to is something far more meaningful that becomes very much more person-centered. And so questions we can now ask is, what was a great moment or achievement from the past week? When have you had a great day at work? You know, what does it look like? What's happening? What are you doing? Is there a strength that you have that you think is currently underused? What development are you looking for? Are there things you want to do more of? And I think there's a lot in this that gets really interesting, not just for the younger generations, because when we talk about generations, we tend to sort of sway it to the younger. But actually, if you think that, for example, boomers or the silent generation, the thing that we typically get wrong is we will automatically put people on what we call wind down mode. If we think they might be getting near to retirement, we might sort of put them on that mode, whether they like it or not, which does a massive disservice because some people might want to kind of have that traditional sort of wind down mode and what that means for them. But actually, there's a real opportunity to change the conversation. I was working one-on-one with a senior leader recently who was in that position. They were looking to retire in 18 months' time. And they were starting to feel pretty disengaged because they didn't necessarily feel that their expertise was being recognised, if you think back to the previous table, because they were being put on wind down mode. And so actually the conversation can change. Instead of, well, how would you kind of phase out? It's how do you leave your role on an absolute high? If you leave on a peak, what does it look like? What are you doing between now and then that really lights you up? It changes the conversation from, again, that wind down into something that's really meaningful, that's, again, person-centered. It's coming from self-determination theory, driving that internal motivation, and leaves people feeling more engaged. And we know, especially for the older generations, or kind of older age groups, as we now kind of see it, that actually those conversations about internal motivation, what drives you, is really lacking. We often focus on external motivators, that carrot on the end of the stick, that kind of pay progression. But actually what we know is that internal motivation is massively underutilized when we think about leadership, but we also think about organizations generally. There's a massive opportunity if we can tap into it. So these are the questions that can start to bring out a richer conversation with individuals. And this spans not even inside of work, also outside of work too. We can be having conversations, better conversations with our people down the local football club, or even our children, our friends, whoever it might be, our parents. It starts to change the game. But there's also still a challenge at team level, because that's all well and good when you're working one-on-one with an individual. But at a team level, you are also still facing the team seeing the negative, not so positive stereotypes in other individuals. And this is where it can create a tremendous amount of friction, especially when we think about, creating the environment to have high innovation and things. There are some barriers in the way, and often it's perceptions of other generations, stereotypes that we hold. And so from a leadership perspective, sometimes that can leave us feeling like we're dealing with a standoff. We end up with younger generations pointing, well, those generations over there don't understand us, and the older generations turning around and saying they just, they've got low work ethic. It's really challenging to navigate. And so the best gift that we can give is trying to turn our team's perception of some of these generational differences, these friction points, into the strengths that do fundamentally exist, and understanding how we can each support each other to achieve a team that looks more like the bottom set of strengths, which me personally, I'd rather be a part of a team that really embraces that versus the top kind of negative stereotypes. So in terms of the three quick wins, the three quick wins that I often advocate are really, again, thinking back to self-determination theory. It's grounded in the stuff that we know supports people to bring their best to work. So thinking beyond the lanyard, getting people to know each other beyond the job title. What's really interesting is when you actually get to know people to know each other, they might have worked with each other for years. In fact, there was two individuals who worked together for 14 years, had a discussion about stuff, not just the, oh, what did you do at the weekend, or kind of, what's going on for you work-wise. A genuine conversation. They learned things about each other that they had no idea about. And it's incredible when you start to do this with teams. I mean, we've had people who've been Olympic skaters, and, at weekend, they go and milk cows because they had a background in farming. It's fascinating what you can learn about each other, but it's this getting to know each other that creates that sense of belonging. And what's interesting is we can often see that team level of resilience can rise where we create a stronger sense of belonging. We create a stronger sense of team because it breaks down silos. It breaks down, or can break down, them and us mentality, which again, if we think about generations, comes into play. We then have understanding strength. So again, trying to see actually not just the things that frustrate us, but actually what is the gift that different generations, different people from different backgrounds, even outside of generations, can bring to the table, but also advocating for what I need as well. And then finally, a clear shared vision. It's one of the things that's often missing in teams. It's that clear why. Why do we exist? If we were plucked out, what would that gap be? Because that's the thing that drives us. And actually having that kind of clear shared vision really links strongly to that contribution. We might all be doing different things. We might be approaching it from a different way. We might be using our strengths differently in line with our generation, but actually we're all here to achieve a certain specific aim and a certain specific why. It's incredibly powerful. And even if we take outside of the workplace for a second, we can look at, for example, Mehdi Cordy he was the head of high performance cycling for the Netherlands Olympic team. And I had the privilege of listening to him speak at an event last year. And he talked about his experience kind of before he moved into the Netherlands Olympic cycling team. And he had a really dysfunctional team. Now, it wasn't generations based, this was dysfunctional for a different reason. But what he found is crafting, in a short term perspective, crafting that really clear shared vision, a lot of those frictions dissipated. Now, in that context, it was a short term aim. You still have to challenge some of the things, the undercurrent of what creates that friction. But we can see that actually having that really clear why, that clear North Star, that clear place that we're aiming to creates that sense of unity, creates that sense of team and that sense of contribution as well. Now, there are lots of other kind of quick wins. And again, these are quick, not necessarily easy, but they're the things that can try to unite a team rather than staying in that difference. And it goes for things even past generations, because ultimately what we're pointing to and the things that we kind of talk repeatedly about are twofold. One, creating compassionate leadership, really critical when we think about generational differences, and great leadership anyway, but also creating inclusive cultures. What is the environments where everyone can thrive, regardless of what experience they bring, whether it's because they're from a different generation, whether it's because they're an introvert or an extrovert, or from a different culture. It's a really powerful thing. And so these are things that can help move that needle. With that being said, we have covered a lot of ground in terms of today's session. So we started off, we tried to unpick some of the myths and some of the stereotypes about generations. We then looked at rebuilding the generational picture that's actually informed by the evidence base. And then we started to look at what this means for you, what it might mean for your leadership, your team, and your organization. You might have other ideas as well as to what it means for you off the back of what we've discussed. But in terms of some of the key things that I hope you leave today's session with. So firstly, generational differences have always existed. We might have only started calling the generations by name as of the late 1800s, but actually we know we've been through a bit of a journey through history, haven't we? Where we can see that actually a lot of the frustrations that we're talking about today, we were talking about 4,000 years ago and probably even 4,000 years before that. Equally, generations are actually characterized by age and environment rather than being a personality type. We can't put the boomer in a box and say this is exactly what a baby boomer is like. We might have, for example, somebody, let's say Gen X, who's just going into kind of parenthood, who has more in similar with a Gen Z going into parenthood than they do people from their own generation. So we know it's different. It's about life stage, it's about age, it's about environment. Each generation as well brings its strengths. And if we can understand what these are and we can harness them, it leaves us all in a better position. But each generation also has specific needs to be met at work, and these do slightly differ depending on, again, like we said, age and environment, which is generations. And so the ultimate key for leaders is to know our teams as individuals. There are no two Gen X the same, there are no two Gen Z the same. And so understanding our individuals, making those conversations meaningful is a real powerful first step in terms of generational inclusion. Secondly, focusing on those leveraging strengths. Whether we use a particular strengths profiler or whether we just ask what on a great day and things are going really well, what is lighting you up and why? And finally, supporting others to navigate generational differences. It can feel sticky, and especially when we think of inside of work, but outside of work as well, there's a real opportunity to create more inclusion on a, if I'm honest, a societal scale to really set everybody up for success. So, with that being said, we have covered a tremendous amount of ground in this hour and a half, and I would love to know in the chat what has resonated with you from all the things that we've covered so far, right the way from the stereotypes at the start and through to the generational game, through to actually a little bit through history, and finally into what we all need at work and how that might relate to where we are generationally as well. And I'd also love to know what's one thing that you're going to do off the back of today's session. Whether it's go and research a little bit more about generations, whether it's to go and change how you might tackle one-to-ones, whether it's to just go and have a bit of a Google search or read upon some research, whatever it might be, I would love to know what's one thing that you'll do differently. So I can see Donald's got to treat people the way they want. Absolutely. Yeah. We can't treat people all the same. Actually, we come at it so much stronger in terms of getting the best out of people when we treat people as they want to be treated. bit hard. I love this. We've got Bethany talking about this is for me why building a coaching culture in organizations and enhancing coaching skills in our leaders and managers is so important. Absolutely. Was coaching a really senior leader recently who was going through a mass restructure in their organization, very big restructure. And they had been through restructures many times before. So they knew it would be tough, but they knew they'd be okay on the far side of it because they've had that experience of being okay on the far side of it in restructures before. But they had more junior members of the team, Gen Z, millennials, who this was their first restructure. And if we think about what it's like going through your first restructure, it often feels like the worst. We don't have the life experience to tell us that we'll be okay. And so it can feel really daunting, especially when we know it's filled with uncertainty. And the one thing that we all don't like as humans is uncertainty. Increases fear, activates areas of our brain like our amygdala or our fear center, so we can't necessarily think from our prefrontal cortex, from our rational, logical standpoint. And so what this leader was getting really stuck with is I'm telling people it'll be okay, it'll be fine, and they're just not getting it. And it's almost making them worse. Well, of course it's making them worse because actually from their point of view, from their reality, they feel like this is almost feels world ending to them. And so actually if we can use the coaching approach, it really turns it into acknowledging actually how people feel and then what they need ultimately to be able to thrive. So it's fascinating. Absolutely agree with you on the coaching skills point of view. We've got a lot about changing one-to-ones. People are still individuals and have their own needs. Absolutely. The one meaningful conversation a week. It's really fascinating, Sheena, when we actually look at a little bit more around what they said. They actually said that the conversation doesn't have to be that long. I think they noted it was about 15 minutes, which is staggering. And the sentiment was actually if you meet with your team every week, 15 minutes is fine. If you meet with your team kind of fortnightly, half an hour. But it's fascinating. We think leadership is fundamentally a human sport. And actually to get it right, when we start to put that at the centre and we start to put our teams at the centre, it really changes the game. And it links to so much, whether we think of servant leadership, transformational leadership, authentic leadership, they all point towards that same direction. Flipping the stereotypes into strengths, absolutely. Definitely recommend reading up on the golden principles. So self-determination theory. I'll also make sure we get the slides sent out so you'll have them as well. But there's a particular website for self-determination theory. So well worth a read. But there's lots in there, making time for individual conversations. The other thing we can also do is advocate for our own, because we are also in a generation, we are also people that want to thrive at work. And sometimes as leaders, I also think one of the hardest things is to advocate for ourselves what we need. So we can also prepare for actually, if we want to have more meaningful conversations, how do we instigate that? How do we navigate that? So with that being said, it's been an absolute pleasure spending the last hour and a half with you. If you have any burning questions that are still kind of stuck in your head, throw them in the chat now, because what we'll do, like I said, is be able to collate as many questions as possible. We'll pull together a bit of a resource where it comes back to all the questions so that if somebody else has asked a question, you think that's a really good question, you'll also get the answer too. And we'll be able to flick through the previous chats as well to make sure that we capture everybody's questions. So with that being said, I think that's it from me. So I'm going to hand back to Francis. But like I said, keep popping in the chat any thoughts or questions or anything else. But it's been wonderful to spend this time with you. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Karis. I absolutely love that. I've been busy writing away lots of notes and just watching the chat, and I can see that everyone's been absolutely engaged, and the action that people are going to do is fantastic. So a massive thank you. I wrote down a few things, and it's interesting that other people have also noted that leadership is a human sport, and I thought that was just a real summary of that, because I think we often sometimes forget that, sadly, things that are going on. But also when you said, where is this person in their career and life, and given this, how can I support them to bring their best to work? And I thought that was just absolutely lovely. So I've got loads of things I'm going to just, keep remembering and reminding myself, and treat other people how they want to be treated. So you've given us absolutely tons to think about, and how lovely for a Friday morning to do that, and to just really bring that into the rest of the day, and also our weeks ahead. So it's been fantastic, an absolute privilege to chair the session today, and thank you, Karis, and also for everyone else. I can see that people have really enjoyed it. Really appreciate if you give us your evaluation actually, if you wouldn't mind, please, just the QR codes there, and just actually, that made me think, I wonder in future generations if there will be a QR code. Maybe that won't exist. It'll be something else. It was like you said, the save button. That really made me think. So actually, please do give us your evaluation. It's really, really important we get that. That would be fantastic. And just to remind everyone, all the material will be shared, and also, like you said, for some of those research links as well. I know I've written lots of things down, which I'm going to go and read again and look at again, because it's really great to remind ourselves. And just again, let's just a last thank you. So thank you again, and please join us at our next one. We're getting some brilliant audiences at the moment. So the next one on 16th of July, remember that, it's actually my birthday, so there you go. 16th of July at 9:30, and that's all about supporting teams through burnout. So again, a really, really incredible topic, and one that it's good to learn more about and stop and think what we'll do differently. So just say huge thank you to everyone who's joined us, and again to everyone in the Collaborative Masterclass who's enabled this to happen. And our last thanks obviously go to Caris. And thank you so much again, everyone. Take care and have a good Friday. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.